Between 1923 and 1947, the Whitelatch Memorial Institute for Industrial Training in New Orleans claimed the lives of 47 young men under circumstances that authorities consistently classified as accidental drownings. The institute sat on a bend of the Mississippi River, where the water ran dark and swift, carrying secrets downstream that would remain buried for decades. Local fishermen whispered about bodies that surfaced miles away, always young, always bearing the same peculiar marks around their wrists and ankles. The Whitelatch family had built their fortune on river commerce, but their charitable institution would become a feeding ground for horrors that the city's elite worked tirelessly to conceal. What began as a beacon of hope for disadvantaged youth became a death trap where systematic abuse masqueraded as industrial education, and where the river became both accomplice and witness to crimes that would echo through generations. The institution's reputation. The Whitelatch Memorial Institute for Industrial Training opened its doors on September 15, 1922, occupying a sprawling complex of red brick buildings that stretched along the Mississippi River's eastern bank in New Orleans. The facility was the brainchild of Cornelius Whitelatch III, heir to the Whitelatch Shipping Company fortune, who had lost his only son in the Great War and sought to honor his memory by providing industrial training to underprivileged young men between the ages of 16 and 25. The Institute's mission statement, carved in marble above the main entrance, read, "Through honest labor and moral guidance, we forge the leaders of tomorrow." The facility boasted state-of-the-art workshops for carpentry, metalworking, and mechanical repair, along with dormitories that could house up to 200 students at a time. The complex included a dining hall, library, gymnasium, and a private dock where students learned maritime trades essential to New Orleans' port economy. The architectural design reflected the grandeur befitting a Whitelatch enterprise, with Gothic revival elements that echoed the great universities of the North, complete with arched windows, decorative stonework, and towering spires that could be seen from riverboats passing along the Mississippi. Cornelius Whitelatch I presented himself as a progressive philanthropist, often photographed in the Times-Picayune alongside prominent civic leaders and religious figures. His institute received endorsements from Mayor Martin Berman, Archbishop John William Shaw, and numerous business leaders who praised the facility's commitment to transforming wayward youth into productive citizens. The Whitelatch family had been pillars of New Orleans society since the 1840s, their shipping empire built on cotton and sugar exports that made them one of the wealthiest families in the South. Their mansion on St. Charles Avenue was a landmark of antebellum architecture, and their private box at the French Opera House was considered one of the most prestigious social positions in the city. The Institute's first director was Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a former military officer who had served under General John J. Pershing during the Mexican border campaign and later distinguished himself in the European theater during the Great War. Thornfield brought military discipline to the facility, implementing a strict regimen that began with reveille at 5:30 a.m. and concluded with lights out at 9:05 p.m. Students wore standardized uniforms of gray wool with brass buttons bearing the Institute's crest, and addressed all staff members as Sir or Ma'am. The daily schedule included 6 hours of industrial training, 2 hours of academic instruction focusing on mathematics and reading comprehension, 1 hour of physical exercise conducted in military formation, and mandatory chapel services each evening where students received moral instruction. Based on Protestant principles, the facility's reputation for excellence grew rapidly throughout the 1920s, aided by carefully orchestrated publicity campaigns that highlighted success stories and downplayed any negative incidents. Local newspapers regularly featured graduates who had secured employment at major companies or started their own businesses, with particular emphasis on those who had overcome difficult backgrounds to achieve middle-class respectability. The Institute's placement rate exceeded 90%, with many graduates finding work at Whitelatch Shipping Company or other family-controlled enterprises throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. Parents from across the South sent their sons to the Institute, believing it offered a pathway to prosperity that would otherwise be unavailable to young men from impoverished backgrounds. The Institute's board of directors included some of New Orleans' most respected citizens, carefully selected to provide both financial support and social legitimacy. Judge Harold Beauregard, whose family had owned sugar plantations before the Civil War and who now served on the Louisiana Supreme Court, served as board chairman. His presence lent judicial gravitas to the institution and provided valuable connections within the legal system. Reverend William Caldwell of St. Charles Presbyterian Church provided spiritual oversight, ensuring that the Institute's moral instruction aligned with mainstream Protestant values. Dr. Eugene Lafitte, descendant of the famous pirate Jean Lafitte and a prominent physician who served on the boards of 3 hospitals, handled medical affairs and maintained the institution's health standards. These men met monthly in the Institute's oak-paneled boardroom, reviewing financial reports and discussing expansion plans over imported whiskey and Cuban cigars, their conversations ranging from educational policy to political developments that might affect their various business interests. The facility's curriculum emphasized practical skills that aligned perfectly with New Orleans' industrial needs, reflecting the Whitelatch family's deep understanding of regional economic requirements. Students learned to operate steam engines that powered the port's machinery, repair shipping equipment essential to river commerce, and navigate the complex mechanical systems that drove the city's economy. Advanced students worked directly with professional tradesmen brought in from local businesses, gaining hands-on experience that prepared them for immediate employment upon graduation. The Institute maintained formal contracts with over 50 local businesses, including shipping companies, manufacturing firms, and construction contractors, guaranteeing job placement for qualified graduates and ensuring a steady supply of trained workers for the regional economy. The Whitelatch family's commitment to the Institute appeared unwavering and deeply personal. Cornelius the farmer and I personally toured the facility monthly, often bringing potential donors or government officials to observe the students at work and demonstrate the institution's effectiveness. His wife, Margaret Whitelatch, organized annual fundraising galas that raised thousands of dollars for facility improvements and student scholarships, events that became highlights of New Orleans' social calendar and attracted philanthropists from across the South. The family's charitable foundation contributed over $100,000 annually to the Institute's operating budget, ensuring that students from impoverished backgrounds could attend without payment and that the facility could maintain its high standards despite serving a predominantly indigent population. The Institute's success attracted attention from educational reformers nationwide, who saw it as a model for addressing the problem of youth unemployment and social unrest that had emerged in the aftermath of the Great War. Dr. John Dewey visited in 1925, praising the facility's integration of practical training with moral instruction and noting its potential influence on educational policy throughout the United States. The Carnegie Foundation awarded the Institute a commendation for innovative educational practices, and several other cities attempted to replicate the Whitelatch model, though none achieved the same level of success or community support. The facility became a showcase for progressive education, with delegations of educators and philanthropists touring the campus regularly and carrying reports of its methods back to their home communities. The student body reflected New Orleans' diverse population, including young men from Creole families whose fortunes had declined since Reconstruction, Cajun families from rural Louisiana seeking urban opportunities, Irish immigrant sons looking to escape the poverty of the river parishes, and Italian Americans whose families had arrived during the great immigration waves of the 1890s. The Institute's admission process, overseen by Dr. Thornfield and his carefully selected staff, evaluated students based on demonstrated need and potential for improvement rather than academic achievement or family connections. Many enrollees came from broken homes where death, abandonment, or alcoholism had disrupted family structures, had histories of minor criminal activity that suggested they were at risk of more serious legal troubles, or lacked the family support structures necessary to navigate the transition from adolescence to productive adulthood. The facility's disciplinary system was strict but supposedly fair, designed to instill the habits of punctuality, obedience, and respect for authority that employers expected from their workers. Students who violated rules faced consequences ranging from extra work duties and temporary suspension of privileges to more serious punishments that included isolation in dormitory rooms and restriction from recreational activities. Serious infractions could result in expulsion, though the institute prided itself on its low dismissal rate and its ability to rehabilitate even the most challenging students. Dr. Thornfield frequently spoke at educational conferences about the importance of second chances, emphasizing that the institute's mission was redemption rather than punishment, and that every young man deserved an opportunity to prove his worth through honest labor and moral improvement. The institute's physical plant continued to expand throughout the 1920s, reflecting both its growing reputation and the Whitelatch family's continuing investment in its mission. A new dormitory building opened in 1926, featuring modern plumbing and electric lighting that provided students with living conditions superior to those in many private homes. An expanded workshop complex opened in 1928, equipped with the latest industrial machinery and designed to accommodate the growing student body. The facility's private dock was enlarged to accommodate larger vessels, allowing students to gain experience with the steamships and barges that dominated Mississippi River commerce. A new gymnasium was constructed in 1929 with funds donated directly by the Whitelatch family, featuring a basketball court, swimming pool, and exercise equipment that promoted physical fitness and provided healthy outlets for youthful energy. These improvements reinforced the institute's reputation as a first-class educational facility committed to providing the best possible environment for its students' development. Local newspapers regularly published photographs of the expanding campus, often featuring students engaged in various educational and recreational activities that demonstrated their wholesome character and promising futures. The institute's success became a source of civic pride for New Orleans, proof that the city's elite could address social problems through enlightened philanthropy and progressive educational methods. The Whitelatch Memorial Institute for Industrial Training appeared to represent everything positive about American philanthropy and progressive education during the prosperous decade of the 1920s. Its combination of practical training, moral instruction, and disciplined environment seemed to offer a proven formula for transforming disadvantaged youth into productive citizens who would contribute to regional economic development and social stability. The facility's impressive success rate, broad community support, and continued expansion suggested that the Whitelatch family had created something truly beneficial for society, an institution that addressed pressing social needs while advancing the interests of local businesses and the broader community. Local newspapers regularly published glowing reports about the Institute's achievements, with the Times-Picayune's annual feature on New Orleans charitable institutions invariably highlighting the Whitelatch facility as a model of effective philanthropy that other cities should emulate. Society pages documented the elaborate fundraising events that sustained the Institute's operations, portraying the Whitelatch family as exemplars of civic responsibility and Christian charity whose generosity set standards for other wealthy families throughout the South. Editorial writers praised the Institute's approach to social problems, arguing that private philanthropy, guided by business principles, could achieve results that government programs could never match. The Institute's chapel services, led by visiting ministers from various Protestant denominations, emphasized themes of redemption, hard work, and moral improvement that resonated with contemporary religious and social values. Students were encouraged to view their time at the Institute as a spiritual journey, as well as an educational experience, an opportunity to develop both practical skills and moral character that would serve them throughout their lives. The facility's library included extensive collections of religious texts alongside technical manuals and classic literature, reflecting the institution's commitment to developing both vocational competence and cultural refinement among young men who might otherwise lack access to such resources. By 1929, the Whitelatch Memorial Institute for Industrial Training had achieved a reputation as one of the South's premier educational facilities for disadvantaged youth. Its graduates worked in positions of responsibility throughout the region, their success stories regularly featured in newspapers and business publications as evidence of the institute's effectiveness. The facility's innovative programs had influenced educational policy in several states, and its methods were studied by reformers seeking to address similar social problems in their own communities. The institute appeared to be everything its founders had envisioned, a beacon of hope that transformed troubled young men into productive citizens through the power of education, discipline, and moral guidance, proving that American ingenuity and generosity could solve even the most challenging social problems. Ignored signs. The first documented disappearance occurred on October 12, 1923, less than 14 months after the Institute's opening, when the facility was still basking in widespread praise for its innovative approach to youth education. Thomas Lambert, a 17-year-old from Baton Rouge whose father had died in a factory accident and whose mother worked as a seamstress to support her 3 children, failed to appear for morning roll call. Dr. Thornfield reported that Lambert had been despondent about his family's financial troubles and had likely run away during the night, seeking employment that would allow him to send money home to his struggling mother. Local police conducted a perfunctory search of the surrounding neighborhoods, but found no trace of the young man, despite interviewing merchants, dock workers, and other residents who might have encountered a teenager traveling alone. The official report stated that Lambert had probably hitchhiked home to Baton Rouge or sought employment elsewhere in Louisiana, noting that young men from disadvantaged backgrounds frequently left institutional settings when they encountered opportunities for immediate work. Detective William Harris, who handled the case for the New Orleans Police Department, emphasized that the institute's students were legally adults who had the right to leave at any time, and that their departure without formal notice, while inconsiderate, was not unusual behavior for young men of their social class and background. Lambert's mother, Marie Lambert, arrived at the institute 3 days later, demanding answers about her son's disappearance. She insisted that Thomas would never have left without contacting her, particularly given his deep concern for her welfare and his pride in his educational progress at the institute. She questioned why no one had noticed his absence until morning roll call, why his personal belongings remained untouched in his dormitory, and why he had left behind the money she had sent him for personal expenses. Dr. Thornfield explained that students were expected to remain in their dormitories after lights out, and that bed checks were conducted only in cases of suspected illness or misconduct. He suggested that Thomas might have been embarrassed about leaving the program and would contact his family once he had secured employment and could report success rather than failure. Marie Lambert left the institute unsatisfied with these explanations, but her subsequent letters to city officials and newspapers were dismissed as the desperate pleadings of a distraught mother, unable to accept that her son had chosen to leave without explanation. The Times-Picayune published a brief item about the missing student, but emphasized the institute's excellent reputation and suggested that the disappearance was an isolated incident unlikely to reflect broader problems with the facility's management or student care. The second disappearance followed a remarkably similar pattern just 4 months later. On February 8, 1924, 19-year-old James Franklin from Shreveport vanished during the night, leaving behind all personal possessions and no indication of planned departure. Like Lambert, Franklin was described as a model student who had shown no signs of dissatisfaction with the institute's programs. His dormitory roommate, Carl Bennett, reported that Franklin had seemed troubled in the days before his disappearance, mentioning strange meetings with staff members and expressing fear about something he couldn't articulate clearly. Franklin had spoken about being selected for special training, but had refused to provide details when Bennett pressed for more information. Bennett's account was initially dismissed as the confused recollections of a grief-stricken friend who might be unconsciously embellishing ordinary events in an attempt to find explanations for his roommate's unexpected departure. Dr. Thornfield assured Franklin's family that their son had likely found employment in the maritime industry and would contact them soon, noting that the Institute's records showed Franklin had expressed particular interest in merchant marine work. He suggested that the young man might have signed aboard a ship bound for distant ports, a common practice among restless youth seeking adventure and financial independence. Franklin's father, a railroad worker who had saved for months to provide his son with the opportunity to attend the institute, accepted this explanation initially, but grew increasingly suspicious when months passed without any word from James. His letters to shipping companies and maritime unions produced no evidence that his son had enlisted as a sailor, and his inquiries to other cities yielded no trace of the missing young man. The third disappearance differed from the previous cases in one crucial detail, an eyewitness account that would haunt the observer for the rest of his life. On June 15, 1924, Albert Fisher, an 18-year-old from Lake Charles whose family had sent him to the institute after a series of minor scrapes with local law enforcement, saw fellow student Raymond Elliott being escorted from the dormitory by three men he didn't recognize. Fisher later described the men as well-dressed but unfamiliar, clearly not members of the institute's regular staff or any visiting dignitaries he had seen during official tours. Elliott appeared to be walking voluntarily, but Fisher noticed that he seemed unsteady on his feet, as if he had been drinking or was ill, and his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by obvious nervousness. When Elliott was reported missing the following morning, Fisher immediately informed dormitory supervisor Harold Price about what he had witnessed during the night. Price thanked Fisher for the information, but warned him against spreading rumors that might damage the institute's reputation and harm the educational opportunities of other students. He explained that Elliott had likely been meeting with potential employers who preferred to conduct interviews during evening hours to avoid disrupting the regular educational schedule. Fisher was transferred to a different dormitory within the week, officially because of overcrowding in his previous quarters, though he suspected the move was intended to separate him from other students who might ask questions about Elliott's disappearance. Fisher never spoke publicly about Elliott's disappearance again during his remaining time at the institute, but years later would describe feeling constantly watched and threatened throughout his final months at the facility. He noticed that certain staff members seemed to take unusual interest in his activities and whereabouts, and he received subtle warnings about the dangers of spreading malicious gossip that might harm the reputation of people who had dedicated their lives to helping disadvantaged youth. The pattern of disappearances continued throughout the mid-1920s with disturbing regularity, occurring roughly every 6 to 8 months, with a consistency that suggested planning rather than random events. Each case followed remarkably similar circumstances. A student would vanish during the night, leaving behind all personal belongings and no indication of planned departure. The missing students were invariably described as well-behaved and academically successful, young men who had shown no signs of dissatisfaction with the Institute's programs or desire to leave before completing their education. Dr. Thornfield consistently attributed these disappearances to runaways seeking immediate employment, or young men who had found work opportunities elsewhere but were too embarrassed or inconsiderate to provide formal notice of their departure. The Institute's board of directors accepted these explanations without question, praising Thornfield's efforts to maintain order and discipline despite the inherent challenges of working with troubled youth from disadvantaged backgrounds. Judge Beauregard frequently noted that young men of this social class often lacked the courtesy and consideration that more privileged families instilled in their children, and that the disappearances, while regrettable, were not unexpected given the students' backgrounds and limited experience with formal institutional expectations. Local law enforcement showed remarkably little interest in investigating these disappearances beyond filing perfunctory missing persons reports. Detective William Harris of the New Orleans Police Department, who handled most of these cases, maintained that young men from disadvantaged backgrounds frequently left institutions without notice when they encountered opportunities for immediate employment. He pointed out that the institute students were legally adults who had the right to leave at any time, and that their departure without formal notification while inconsiderate, was not criminal behavior requiring extensive police investigation. Harris often noted that his department's limited resources were better devoted to investigating crimes with clear evidence of foul play rather than pursuing missing persons cases that likely involved voluntary departures. He suggested that parents who were concerned about their sons' whereabouts should hire private investigators if they wanted more thorough searches conducted, though he acknowledged that few families of institute students possessed the financial resources for such expenditures. The first physical evidence of something more sinister emerged in the spring of 1925, when a fishing crew working near Algiers Point, approximately 15 miles downstream from the institute, discovered the badly decomposed remains of a young man caught in their nets. The body, which had been in the water for several months according to coroner's estimates, showed signs of ligature marks around the wrists and ankles that suggested the deceased had been bound before entering the water. The Orleans Parish Coroner's Office ruled the death an accidental drowning, noting that the Mississippi River claimed numerous victims each year and that the ligature marks could have resulted from debris entanglement during the body's journey downstream. The deceased was never officially identified, despite the availability of dental records and other identifying information from missing persons reports filed throughout the region. The timing and location of the discovery coincided closely with the disappearance of Eugene Hoffman, a 20-year-old student from Alexandria who had vanished in December 1924, but no systematic effort was made to compare the remains. With Hoffman's documented physical characteristics, the body was buried in a pauper's grave after a brief period during which no family members came forward to claim it, and the case file was closed within 2 weeks of the discovery. Similar discoveries occurred with increasing frequency throughout the late 1920s, as bodies surfaced near Chalmette, Bellechasse, and other downriver locations at roughly 6-month intervals. These remains invariably showed similar signs of prolonged submersion and ligature marks that suggested the victims had been restrained before death. The coroner's office consistently ruled these deaths as accidental drownings, often noting that the victims had likely been intoxicated when they entered the water and had become entangled in debris or fishing nets that produced the marks found on their remains. No systematic effort was made to connect these deaths to the missing students from the Whitelatch Institute, despite the obvious geographical and temporal correlations. Dr. Eugene Lafitte, the Institute's medical director and board member, played a crucial role in ensuring that these deaths were not investigated thoroughly or connected to the missing students. His extensive connections within the medical community and his reputation as a descendant of local nobility gave his opinions considerable weight with coroner's office personnel, who frequently consulted him about unusual cases requiring expert medical interpretation. When questioned about the ligature marks found on several bodies, Dr. Lafitte provided authoritative explanations, suggesting that they were caused by debris in the river or by the natural process of decomposition, which could create patterns that inexperienced observers might mistake for evidence of violence. His explanations were accepted without challenge by coroner's office personnel, who lacked the expertise to contradict a physician of his reputation and social standing. The Institute's staff began showing signs of unusual behavior during this period, changes that careful observers might have interpreted as evidence of institutional problems requiring investigation. Several longtime employees left their positions abruptly, citing personal reasons or family obligations that required their immediate attention. Those who remained became increasingly secretive about their work, avoiding social interactions with colleagues and community members who might ask questions about their professional responsibilities. Dorothy Hughes, who worked in the Institute's kitchen and lived in nearby staff quarters, noticed that certain staff members regularly worked late into the night, long after students had retired to their dormitories and normal institutional activities had concluded. Hughes observed that these nocturnal activities often involved the loading and unloading of materials at the Institute's private dock, work that seemed inconsistent with the facility's educational mission and normal operational requirements. When she mentioned these observations to her supervisor, she was told that the institute occasionally received deliveries of educational materials and supplies during evening hours. To avoid disrupting daytime instructional activities, and that her concerns, while understandable, reflected a misunderstanding of normal institutional operations. Students also began exhibiting signs of fear and anxiety that extended far beyond the normal stresses associated with institutional life and vocational education. Classroom performance declined noticeably across multiple subject areas, with previously successful students showing difficulty concentrating and completing assignments. Disciplinary incidents increased dramatically, with students violating rules they had previously followed without difficulty and displaying aggressive behavior toward staff members and fellow students. Many students requested transfers to other institutions or early termination of their enrollment, citing homesickness or dissatisfaction with the educational programs. Dr. Thornfield attributed these problems to the normal challenges of working with troubled youth, but the pattern was unlike anything the Institute had experienced during its early years of operation, when student morale and academic performance had been consistently high. The most significant warning sign came in the form of a letter written by student Walter Green to his sister in Mobile, Alabama, a document that would later be recognized as crucial evidence of the Institute's criminal activities. Green described strange nocturnal activities at the Institute, including unexplained absences of fellow students and mysterious visitors who arrived after dark in expensive automobiles bearing no identification. He mentioned specific concerns about Dr. Thornfield and several other staff members, suggesting that they were involved in activities that he couldn't fully understand, but that frightened him deeply. Green's letter described a climate of fear among the students, with many afraid to sleep soundly or to venture outside their dormitories after dark. He wrote about students who had spoken of being selected for special training and had subsequently disappeared without explanation, and about staff members who seemed to be watching certain students with unusual interest. The letter was intercepted by Institute staff before it could be mailed, and Green himself disappeared 3 weeks later, under circumstances identical to the previous cases. Parents of missing students began forming informal networks to share information and pressure authorities for more thorough investigations, recognizing that their individual efforts to locate their sons had been systematically frustrated by institutional and official indifference. Marie Lambert, whose son Thomas had been the first to disappear, became an unofficial leader of these efforts, organizing meetings in New Orleans and corresponding with families throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. These parents compiled detailed lists of missing students, documented patterns in the disappearances, and gathered evidence that suggested something far more sinister than simple runaways or accidental drownings. The parents' efforts were consistently undermined by the Institute's influential supporters, who used their positions in government, law enforcement, and the media to discourage investigations that might damage the institution's reputation. Judge Beauregard used his judicial position to discourage police investigations, arguing that overzealous prosecution of missing persons cases would damage the Institute's ability to help disadvantaged youth, and might discourage other philanthropic efforts to address social problems. Reverend Caldwell preached sermons about the importance of faith and patience, suggesting that the missing young men would eventually return home safely, and that excessive worry about their welfare reflected insufficient trust in divine providence. The Institute's fundraising capabilities remained remarkably strong throughout this period, suggesting that the community's elite were either genuinely unaware of the growing problems or had chosen to ignore warning signs that might threaten their investment in the institution's success. The annual galas continued to raise substantial funds from New Orleans' most prominent families, and the Whitelatch family's charitable foundation maintained its generous support without any apparent reduction in enthusiasm or financial commitment. Society pages in local newspapers continued to portray the Institute as a model of effective philanthropy, with no mention of the troubling pattern of disappearances that had claimed nearly 24 young men. By 1929, 23 students had disappeared from the Whitelatch Memorial Institute for Industrial Training under circumstances that should have triggered comprehensive criminal investigations. At least 9 bodies had been recovered from the Mississippi River, showing clear evidence of violence, but none had been officially connected to the missing students, despite obvious correlations in timing and location. The pattern of disappearances, the physical evidence of violence, and the systematic cover-up efforts should have alerted authorities to the presence of serious criminal activity, but the Institute's reputation remained intact, protected by influential supporters who prioritized institutional preservation over truth and justice. Horror uncovered. The first crack in the Institute's carefully maintained facade came from an entirely unexpected source, a routine inspection by federal labor investigators in March 1931, conducted as part of a broader examination of youth employment practices mandated by the Department of Labor. The timing of this investigation was fortuitous, occurring during a period when the Institute's criminal activities had reached their peak and when the perpetrators had grown confident enough in their protection to become careless about concealing evidence. Inspector Frank Reynolds arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, intending to conduct a standard 2-day review of student work assignments and safety protocols, but his methodical approach and attention to detail would ultimately expose one of the most systematic and horrific series of crimes in American history. Reynolds immediately noticed irregularities in the Institute's record-keeping that suggested either gross administrative incompetence or deliberate falsification of documents. Student enrollment records showed significant discrepancies between admissions and graduations, with dozens of students listed as transferred or withdrawn without supporting documentation explaining their destinations or reasons for departure. When Reynolds requested contact information for students who had supposedly left the Institute to verify their current status and employment, Dr. Thornfield provided only vague explanations about young men who had found employment in distant cities or returned to their families without leaving forwarding addresses. The inspector's suspicions deepened considerably when he observed the students' behavior during his facility tour and individual interviews. Many appeared nervous and reluctant to speak with him, even when questioned privately about routine matters related to their educational experiences and future plans. Those who did respond to his questions gave rehearsed-sounding answers about their satisfaction with the Institute's programs, speaking in mechanical tones that suggested they had been coached about appropriate responses to official inquiries. Reynolds noted that several students showed signs of physical abuse, including unexplained bruises, cuts and burns that they attributed to workshop accidents, though the patterns and severity of these injuries seemed inconsistent with normal industrial training mishaps. Reynolds extended his investigation well beyond the scheduled 2-day visit, requesting permission to examine the Institute's financial records and personnel files in detail. Dr. Thornfield initially resisted these demands, claiming that such documents contained confidential information about students and staff that could not be shared without explicit authorization from the board of directors. However, Reynolds' federal authority ultimately compelled cooperation, and he gained access to files that revealed disturbing patterns of unusual expenditures and suspicious staff turnover that demanded further investigation. The Institute's financial records showed regular payments to individuals who were not listed as employees in any official capacity, including several men with criminal records who had been hired as security consultants, despite having no apparent qualifications for such positions. Large cash withdrawals occurred monthly with suspicious regularity, always coinciding with or immediately following the disappearances of students, suggesting that these funds were being used for purposes that required secrecy and untraceable transactions. The Institute had also purchased unusual equipment that had no obvious connection to educational activities, including heavy chains, concrete blocks, rope, and a motorboat that was not listed in any inventory of educational materials or recreational equipment. Reynolds' most shocking discovery came when he gained access to Dr. Thornfield's private office during an unguarded moment while the director was attending to an emergency with the facility's steam heating system. Hidden behind a bookshelf that appeared to be permanently affixed to the wall Reynolds found a collection of photographs and documents that revealed the true nature of the Institute's operations and provided irrefutable evidence of systematic criminal activity extending back nearly a decade. The photographs showed students in various stages of undress, bound with ropes and chains, and displaying obvious signs of physical abuse and torture. The documents included detailed records of which students had been selected for special training, and when they had been processed using clinical terminology that barely concealed the horror of what had occurred. The federal inspector immediately contacted FBI agents in New Orleans, who arrived at the institute within hours, accompanied by federal prosecutors and forensic specialists. The ensuing investigation revealed a network of abuse and murder that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade, protected by the institute's respected reputation and the social connections of its perpetrators. Dr. Thornfield, several staff members, and outside accomplices had been systematically selecting vulnerable students for torture and murder, using the institute's Riverside location to dispose of bodies in the Mississippi River, where the current would carry evidence far downstream and decomposition would make identification difficult. The investigation uncovered a basement chamber beneath the institute's main building that had been secretly converted into a sophisticated torture facility designed for prolonged abuse sessions. The room contained restraining devices specifically constructed for human victims, instruments of torture, including heated metal implements and cutting tools, and bloodstains that forensic experts determined had accumulated over several years. Students had been brought to this chamber during the night hours when other residents were asleep, subjected to prolonged abuse that often lasted for days, and then murdered when their tormentors grew tired of their suffering. The bodies were weighted with concrete blocks and dumped into the river from the institute's private dock during pre-dawn hours when river traffic was minimal and the likelihood of observation was reduced. The perpetrators had developed efficient methods for disposing of evidence, including acid baths for destroying personal belongings and clothing, and furnaces for burning documents and other materials that might connect specific victims to their crimes. FBI agents arrested Dr. Thornfield and 4 staff members on federal charges of kidnapping and murder, while additional warrants were issued for several individuals who had fled the area upon learning of the investigation. The federal charges were necessary because local authorities had demonstrated their unwillingness to pursue serious investigations of the Institute's activities, and because the transportation of victims and disposal of bodies across state lines brought the crimes under federal jurisdiction. The investigation revealed that Thornfield had been recruiting accomplices from among the Institute's security staff and maintenance workers, offering them substantial payments for their participation in the crimes and threatening them with exposure and prosecution if they attempted to withdraw from the criminal conspiracy. Several of these men had criminal backgrounds that made them vulnerable to blackmail, and they had been attracted to the Institute precisely because it provided access to vulnerable victims who were unlikely to be missed by families or authorities. The most horrifying aspect of the investigation was the systematic nature of the abuse and the elaborate record-keeping that documented every aspect of the crimes. The perpetrators had developed detailed selection criteria for choosing victims, targeting students who had few family connections, whose disappearances were unlikely to generate significant attention, and who possessed physical characteristics that appealed to their sadistic preferences. They had also created extensive photographic and written records of their crimes, including detailed descriptions of torture sessions and victim responses that revealed a level of planning and organization that suggested the crimes had been committed for both sadistic pleasure and potential blackmail purposes. The investigation also revealed that several prominent community members had been aware of the Institute's criminal activities, but had chosen to remain silent in exchange for financial payments or other considerations. Judge Beauregard had received detailed reports of suspicious deaths and disappearances, but had used his judicial influence to prevent thorough investigations, ensuring that coroners' inquests reached predetermined conclusions. That protected the Institute from scrutiny. Dr. Lafitte had been present during several of the torture sessions and had used his medical knowledge to prolong the victim's suffering, applying techniques that would maximize pain while preventing premature death. Reverend Caldwell had provided spiritual counseling to the perpetrators, helping them justify their actions through distorted religious interpretations that portrayed their victims as inherently sinful individuals whose suffering served God's purposes. His participation was particularly shocking, given his prominent position in the religious community and his public advocacy for moral education and youth development. The most disturbing revelation involved Cornelius Whitelatch II himself, whose role extended far beyond simple negligence or willful blindness, to include active participation in planning and financing the criminal enterprise. FBI agents discovered that he had been the primary architect of the operation, using his family's wealth and social connections to create a protected environment for systematic abuse and murder. The Institute's charitable mission had been a carefully constructed facade, designed to provide access to vulnerable victims while maintaining community support and avoiding official suspicion. Whitelatch's motivations appeared to combine sadistic pleasure with substantial financial gain derived from the systematic exploitation of his victims. The torture sessions had been filmed and photographed using sophisticated equipment, with the resulting materials sold to wealthy collectors of such content throughout the United States and Europe. The Institute had also been used to recruit young men for a broader network of abuse that extended throughout the South, with students being sold to accomplices in other cities for continued exploitation in various forms of criminal activity. The investigation revealed that at least 47 students had been murdered at the Institute between 1923 and 1931, though the actual number was likely higher given the destruction of records and the failure to recover all bodies. The victims ranged in age from 16 to 25, and they had come from across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. Most had been from impoverished backgrounds with limited family support, making them ideal targets for predators who needed victims whose disappearances would not generate significant attention from law enforcement or media outlets. The physical evidence collected during the investigation included hundreds of photographs documenting various stages of abuse, detailed written records of the torture sessions, and the torture chamber itself with its sophisticated restraint systems and specialized implements. Forensic experts determined that the abuse had escalated dramatically over time, with later victims subjected to increasingly severe torture before being killed. The perpetrators had also experimented with different methods of murder, apparently seeking to maximize their victims' suffering while avoiding detection. The investigation's findings sent shockwaves through New Orleans society and beyond, destroying reputations that had been built over generations and exposing the corruption that had allowed such crimes to undetected. The Whitelatch family's reputation was destroyed overnight. Their business empire began to collapse as partners and customers severed relationships, and their social standing evaporated as former friends and associates distanced themselves from the scandal. The Institute's board of directors faced criminal charges for their roles in covering up the crimes, and several prominent community members were implicated in the broader network of abuse and corruption. The families of the missing students finally received confirmation of their worst fears, learning that their sons had been murdered within months of their disappearance rather than simply running away or finding employment elsewhere. Parents who had spent years searching for their children and pleading with authorities for thorough investigations discovered that their sons had died horrible deaths, while community leaders who possessed the power to intervene had chosen to protect institutional interests over human lives. The systematic nature of the crimes and the elaborate cover-up efforts made their grief even more profound as they realized that their children's deaths could have been prevented if authorities had acted on the numerous warnings and suspicious circumstances that had been reported over the years. The investigation also revealed the extent to which the Institute's crimes had been facilitated by community indifference and official corruption that extended throughout New Orleans' power structure. Police officers had been bribed to avoid thorough investigations of missing persons reports. Coroner's office personnel had been pressured to rule suspicious deaths as accidents, and civic leaders had prioritized institutional reputation over public safety. The entire community had failed to protect its most vulnerable members, allowing wealth and social connections to shield systematic murder from detection and prosecution. The Whitelatch Memorial Institute for Industrial Training was permanently closed following the arrests, and its buildings were sealed as crime scenes while federal investigators continued their work. The facility's remaining students were transferred to other institutions throughout Louisiana and Mississippi, though many required extensive psychological counseling to recover from their experiences and the trauma of learning about their murdered classmates. The institute's closure marked the end of one of the most systematic and prolonged series of crimes in American history, but it also represented the beginning of a cover-up effort that would prove nearly as elaborate as the crimes themselves. Legacy and silence. The criminal trials that followed the FBI investigation should have provided justice for the victims and accountability for the perpetrators, serving as a definitive statement that wealth and social position could not protect those who committed heinous crimes against society's most vulnerable members. Instead, they became elaborate exercises in damage control, orchestrated by powerful interests determined to limit public exposure of the crimes and protect the broader network of corruption that had enabled them. The proceedings began in federal court in New Orleans in September 1932, with Judge Andrew Morrison presiding over what newspapers initially described as the trial of the century, though coverage would prove far more limited than such a designation might suggest. Dr. Marcus Thornfield, facing charges of kidnapping and murder in connection with 47 documented deaths, retained a team of prominent defense attorneys led by Senator Robert Talmadge, a former Confederate officer whose law firm represented many of the South's wealthiest families and most powerful political figures. Talmadge's defense strategy focused on portraying his client as a dedicated educator who had been overwhelmed by the challenges of working with troubled youth and had gradually lost his moral bearings under the pressure of impossible circumstances. He argued that the deaths had resulted from accidents and suicides rather than systematic murder, suggesting that the physical evidence had been misinterpreted by federal investigators eager to justify their expensive investigation. The prosecution's case was systematically undermined from the very beginning by the mysterious disappearance of crucial evidence and the sudden unavailability of key witnesses. The torture chamber beneath the institute had been cleared of most physical evidence before FBI agents could complete their documentation, with local officials claiming that structural concerns required immediate removal of materials that might pose safety hazards. Hundreds of photographs and documents that had been carefully catalogued during the initial investigation vanished from federal custody, with officials attributing their loss to clerical errors and inadequate security procedures. Key witnesses, including several students who had survived the abuse and possessed first-hand knowledge of the crimes, suddenly became unavailable to testify, with some disappearing entirely and others claiming to have no memory of events they had previously described in detail to federal investigators. Those who did testify provided accounts that contradicted their earlier statements, suggesting they had been subjected to pressure or threats that convinced them to modify their testimony in ways that supported the defense rather than the prosecution. Cornelius Whitelatch comments, I never faced trial for his role in the crimes, dying suddenly of a heart attack in his mansion on St. Charles Avenue on October 15, 1932, just 2 weeks before he was scheduled to be arraigned on federal charges. His personal physician, Dr. Eugene Lafitte, certified the death as resulting from natural causes related to the stress of the investigation and the destruction of his family's reputation. Though no autopsy was performed, despite requests from federal prosecutors who suspected foul play. Whitelatch's death eliminated the prosecution's star defendant and removed the person most capable of explaining the full scope of the criminal enterprise and identifying other participants in the conspiracy. The trials that did proceed were marked by judicial irregularities and prosecutorial timidity that suggested the fix was in from the very beginning. Judge Morrison, who had received substantial political and financial support from the Whitelatch family over the years, and whose own family had business relationships with Whitelatch Enterprises, consistently ruled in favor of the defense on crucial evidentiary matters. He excluded testimony from several key witnesses, dismissed much of the physical evidence as improperly obtained or irrelevant to the specific charges, and limited the prosecution's ability to present evidence about the systematic nature of the crimes and the broader conspiracy that had enabled them. Dr. Thornfield's trial lasted only 6 weeks, far shorter than expected, given the magnitude of the charges and the complexity of the evidence that should have been presented. The prosecution was unable to present much of its most damning evidence due to the court's restrictive rulings, and the defense successfully portrayed the defendant as a scapegoat for crimes committed by others who had since died or fled the jurisdiction. The jury, composed entirely of white men from prominent New Orleans families with social and business connections to the defendants, deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on reduced charges of manslaughter rather than the murder charges that federal prosecutors had sought. Thornfield received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, far less than the death penalty that prosecutors had sought and that the evidence clearly supported. The other defendants received even lighter sentences, with most serving fewer than 10 years in minimum security facilities that more closely resembled country clubs than prisons. Judge Morrison justified these lenient sentences by noting the defendants' previous good character and their valuable contributions to the community, arguing that harsh punishment would serve no constructive purpose and might discourage other philanthropic efforts to address social problems. The civil lawsuits filed by victims' families faced similar obstacles and met with even less success than the criminal proceedings. The Whitelatch family's attorneys, led by some of the most expensive legal talent available in the United States, argued that the estate could not be held responsible for crimes committed by institute employees acting outside their authorized duties and in direct violation of institutional policies. They also claimed that the family's charitable foundation was a separate legal entity that should not be liable for the institute's actions, and that the victims' families had no standing to sue because they could not prove that specific individuals had been murdered rather than simply disappearing for unknown reasons. These legal arguments were largely successful, with most families receiving minimal settlements that barely covered their legal expenses and required them to sign comprehensive confidentiality agreements that prevented them from discussing the case publicly or cooperating with journalists and researchers who might seek to expose the full truth about the crimes. The settlements also included provisions that barred the families from pursuing additional legal action against any individuals or institutions connected to the case, effectively immunizing the broader conspiracy from future exposure. The Institute's buildings were demolished in 1933, officially due to structural problems that made them unsafe for continued use, but actually to eliminate physical evidence of the crimes and prevent the site from becoming a memorial or pilgrimage destination for the victims' families and supporters. The demolition was completed quickly and quietly, with minimal public notice or media coverage, and the debris was disposed of in locations that ensured no artifacts or evidence could be recovered by investigators or historians. The site was sold to a shipping company controlled by associates of the Whitelatch family, who built a warehouse complex that ensured no memorial or historical marker would commemorate the victims or acknowledge the crimes that had occurred there. The sale price was significantly below market value, suggesting that the transaction was designed to benefit the purchasers rather than maximize recovery for the Whitelatch estate's creditors. The families of the victims found their efforts to seek justice and commemorate their lost children systematically thwarted by institutional resistance and official harassment. Marie Lambert, whose son Thomas had been the first to disappear and who had become an unofficial leader of the family's efforts, attempted to organize a memorial service for all the victims, but was denied permits by city officials who claimed that such an event would constitute a public nuisance and might provoke civil disturbances. When she and other parents tried to hold a private ceremony at the site of the former institute, they were arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace, with several spending days in jail before being released on their own recognizance. The criminal records related to the case were sealed by court order in 1935, officially to protect the privacy of surviving victims and their families from further trauma and public scrutiny. However, the seal also prevented researchers and journalists from accessing information that might have revealed the full extent of the crimes and the cover-up efforts that followed, ensuring that the truth about the Whitelatch Institute would remain hidden from public view. The few documents that remained in public files were heavily redacted, removing names and details that might have implicated other individuals or institutions in the conspiracy. Local newspapers, which had extensively covered the Institute's charitable work during the 1920s and had helped build its reputation as a model philanthropic institution, provided surprisingly minimal coverage of the criminal trials and their aftermath. The Times-Picayune published only brief summaries of the court proceedings, focusing on legal technicalities rather than the human impact of the crimes or the institutional failures that had enabled them. Editorial coverage emphasized the importance of moving forward and not dwelling on past tragedies that might damage the city's reputation and economic development prospects. The surviving students from the Institute found their lives permanently marked by their experiences, with many suffering from what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, though mental health treatment was extremely limited and heavily stigmatized during the 1930s. Several survivors committed suicide in the years following the Institute's closure, unable to cope with their memories and the knowledge that their murdered classmates had been forgotten by the community that should have protected them. Others struggled with addiction and relationship problems throughout their lives, finding it impossible to trust authority figures or form normal social connections. The few survivors who attempted to speak publicly about their experiences faced systematic intimidation and threats that convinced most to remain silent about what they had witnessed. Carl Bennett, who had been Raymond Elliott's roommate and had provided crucial testimony to federal investigators about suspicious activities at the Institute, was found dead in his apartment in 1936. Police ruled his death a suicide, noting a note that claimed he could no longer live with the guilt of surviving when his friends had died, but family members and other survivors suspected foul play and noted that Bennett had recently expressed intentions to write a book about his experiences at the Institute. Other survivors received anonymous warnings to remain silent about their experiences, with some reporting break-ins at their homes and workplaces where nothing was stolen but personal papers and photographs were disturbed. Several reported being followed by unidentified men who made no direct threats, but whose presence served as a constant reminder that their activities were being monitored by individuals with unknown motivations and capabilities. The broader network of abuse that had extended far beyond the Institute was never fully investigated, despite evidence uncovered during the FBI investigation that suggested connections to similar operations in other cities throughout the South. Federal authorities had identified several individuals who had participated in the network and had documented financial transactions that suggested a regional conspiracy involving wealthy individuals and corrupt officials, but the investigation was curtailed after the trials ended and political pressure mounted to avoid further scandals that might damage the region's reputation. Several individuals who had been identified as participants in the network continued to operate with complete impunity, protected by their wealth and social connections and by the official silence that surrounded the entire case. Some moved to other cities where they established new operations, while others simply changed their methods to avoid detection by authorities who had demonstrated their unwillingness to pursue serious investigations of crimes committed by prominent citizens. The site of the former institute became a source of persistent rumors and local legends that reflected the community's subliminal awareness that something terrible had occurred there, even though official silence prevented open discussion of the facts. Workers at the shipping company that occupied the site reported strange sounds and unexplained incidents that led to high turnover rates and difficulty maintaining adequate staffing levels. The Mississippi River near the site was avoided by local fishermen who claimed that their nets frequently caught objects that they preferred not to examine closely, and that the water in that area seemed somehow different from the river's normal flow. The case files that survived the systematic destruction of evidence were eventually transferred to a federal records facility in Texas, where they remained largely forgotten for decades under layers of bureaucratic classification and administrative indifference. Researchers who discovered references to the case in other documents found that their requests for access were consistently denied or ignored, with officials citing ongoing privacy concerns and national security considerations that seemed absurd given the age of the case and the death of all principal participants. The official position remained that the records were sealed to protect the privacy of individuals who might still be alive, though by the 1960s, virtually everyone connected to the case had died of natural causes. The classification seemed designed primarily to prevent embarrassment to institutions and families whose reputations might be damaged by full disclosure of their roles in enabling and covering up the crimes. The Whitelatch family's business empire eventually recovered from the scandal, though under different ownership and management structures that obscured their connection to the disgraced institute. The family name was quietly changed through legal proceedings that attracted no public attention, and their remaining assets were transferred to corporations and trusts with no obvious connection to their previous enterprises. The charitable foundation that had funded the institute continued to operate under a different name, supporting educational programs that carefully avoided any association with institutional care or residential facilities that might remind observers of their previous activities. The legacy of the Whitelatch Memorial Institute for Industrial Training extends far beyond the specific crimes committed within its walls, representing a broader indictment of social systems that allow wealth and privilege to shield systematic abuse from detection and punishment. The case demonstrated how institutional reputation and social connections could be used to protect criminal enterprises, even when physical evidence and witness testimony clearly established the scope of the crimes and the involvement of prominent community members. The cover-up efforts that followed the investigation showed how legal and political systems could be manipulated to avoid accountability and prevent justice, with judges, prosecutors and other officials prioritizing institutional preservation over truth and the rights of victims. The systematic destruction of evidence and intimidation of witnesses revealed the lengths to which powerful interests would go to protect themselves from the consequences of their actions. The 47 confirmed victims of the Institute's crimes were never properly memorialized or honored, their names systematically removed from official records and their stories buried beneath layers of institutional secrecy and official denial. Their families were silenced through legal settlements and intimidation, and their suffering was treated as an acceptable price to pay for preserving the reputations of wealthy and powerful individuals who valued their social standing more than human life. The Mississippi River continues to flow past the site where these young men died, carrying no trace of their suffering or the crimes that cost them their lives. The water that once carried their weighted bodies downstream now passes warehouses and commercial developments that have erased all evidence of the horrors that occurred on its banks between 1923 and 1931. The case remains officially closed, with no ongoing investigation or review of the evidence that might provide closure for the few surviving family members or accountability for the broader conspiracy that enabled the crimes. The sealed records will likely never be opened, and the surviving witnesses have long since died, taking their secrets with them to graves scattered across the South. The truth about the Whitelatch Memorial Institute for Industrial Training died with them, leaving only fragments of testimony and documentary evidence to suggest the full horror of what occurred along the banks of the Mississippi River during those dark years when wealth and privilege provided immunity from justice, and when society's most vulnerable members were sacrificed to protect the reputations of their supposed benefactors. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering